So the Nightcap National Park and Terania Creek in particular are very personal for me because I've lived there for over 40 years. I came there as a young person trying to do a back to the land stunt, which was very, very difficult because we were impoverished. And soon after we arrived, we discovered that the whole area of Terania Creek was to be logged. And in fact, at that stage, it was to be clear fallen. So we went into shock as we arrived at this beautiful place and realised we could lose it. So the next 10 years of my life were involved in not just trying to make a living out of a farm, have some children, but also try to protect this very special place. And we didn't even realise at the time how special it was until other people such as scientist Professor Len Webb helped us understand how important rainforest was for a start and what a small area it makes up of Australia, but how important that particular area, that nightcap area, was. And ever since then I've been learning increasingly about the botany, less so about the fauna, and realising that the Nightcap National Park is a spectacularly important area in the whole of Australia, and that means the world. So I've always engaged with that on that level of knowing European botany and being interested in that. But as well as that, I've been very personally engaged in the perspective that I have an inkling the Aboriginal people have with this land, and that is a very deep spiritual connection with the land. And by spiritual I mean knowing that you're part of something bigger than yourself. I've always had that for that forest. And that was deep enough, but I discovered that when you fight for something, your connection becomes even deeper, and I'm sure that's what the Koori people have always felt. We Whiteys tend to think that we had the first active protection of a landscape, but it wasn't, it was them. And I began to learn what they'd gone through, fighting for something that you could lose, that was spectacularly beautiful, that was scientifically important, and that it was your mainstay of your very existence. I didn't have really any boundaries between my property and the forest. I just felt like all of it was part of me and I belonged to it. And my kids felt that too. It's hard to describe how devastating it was, but for us it started on the 8th of November when someone reported, we weren't there at the time, someone reported a little smoke in the middle of Terania Creek Basin. By that evening it was a glow, and by the night time it was a volcano. The whole place had just erupted. So we went up there to stay there, to defend our house if necessary, and we stayed the night, didn't sleep much, stayed the night on a grassy hill on the farm, looking at the basin go up. And for me it just felt like the end of the world. I couldn't believe that this thing could erupt like that. So for the next few days we were defending houses. The fire came within 20 metres of our house. It wiped out about half of our forested land on our property. And then we spent weeks after that defending the ridges, other people's houses, other forests for a long time. Night patrols, working with the RFS, working with national parks. It was a big event for the whole community. And I think it was lucky that we were busy because it was so devastating and the grief was so overwhelming that you had to stay busy, otherwise you would just collapse. And I can feel myself getting teary talking about it now, but it was just, it felt like a complete catastrophe to lose this forest that the whole community had fought for so long and we thought could not burn. And to have all that thrown out the window and realise, yep, it can burn, things can change. And we realise it's because it's global heating that's doing this. When things get hot enough and dry enough, it doesn't matter what they are, they will burn. That was a big revelation for us. And that's continued ever since, because I've been working with national parks to do some research work on how rainforests are recovering after these burns. And you can say, yep, it's coming back. There's reshoots on some of the dead trees. There's a lot of seedling regrowth. But overall, my impression is this is very frightening because we don't know whether the whole structure of the forest will ever come back. And we know it will take hundreds of years, if not thousands, to regain the correct structure or the original structure. But apart from that, many of the seedlings that are coming up now are weed seedlings, which would never have been in that forest before because it was too shady. And the shade would not have allowed them to get going. So now you've got new weeds coming in which could eventually take over the site. And apart from that, there's a lot of sclerophyll species, that's the dry leaf species, coming up, which may make the whole rainforest edge much more flammable. So we think that the forest is at great risk from this event alone, but if that event is continued every couple of years, then it could be the end of the rainforest. And that sounds incredibly extreme, but I think that's what we're facing now with global heating. Well, I could talk about management, but I think the first thing we have to do is talk about the big things, which is reversing global heating. And that sounds very difficult, I know, but if we don't do something about global heating, then all the management in the world is not going to help us. It doesn't matter how well you manage it, if it's getting hotter and drier and more monsoonal. That's the big issue in this area. But even if our rainfall stays the same, we know it's becoming stretched at the extremes. So we're going to have very long dry periods with burning and then intense wet periods with flooding. So that's what's driving this issue at the moment. It's not whether we manage to this or that. I think that's the first thing. Make sure we're working on global heating. The second thing is stop logging native forests, because the rainforests don't need the management of sclerophyll forests next to them, which may include burning. They need protection now to get back to where they were. And we also need these bigger forests to develop on into old growth forests, because we know, it's quite clear now, that old growth forests are the best protection against fire. They don't burn easily. They burn occasionally, but it cannot be every 1,000 years, and that's enough for them to generate. They don't need to keep burning. So what we need to do is try to get all of our forests back into an old growth situation if we possibly can. We know that young growth forests encourage fire. And we also know that it is an increasing problem with so-called hazard reduction burning, that will increase fire as well. I think we need to change the terminology to say we're talking about preemptive burning. I think it's okay to reduce hazards around houses, for instance, because houses burn and people die. So it's fair enough to burn around houses and maybe even clear around houses, which is really hard, and that is hazard reduction burning. But when we're talking about whole-scale burning of native forests to reduce hazard, what we're really talking about is preemptive burning. I'd like to see us change this terminology if we possibly can. What I personally learnt was the way rainforest burns. I had no idea about that. And what often happened in this particular situation was, it might not be a conflagration, but it might not be a major fire. It was just a trickle burn coming through the trash of the leaves of the palm forest, which burnt the leaves and just boiled the base of the palms, which then died later on. But apart from that, it would trickle on to a big tree with a hollow. It might be a big fig tree or a brush box or some other kind of rainforest tree. If it got into the base of that, it very quickly turned it into a chimney. So we had this amazing phenomenon of a fire coming to the edge of rainforest, finding the vulnerable tree, lighting it up. That tree would then fall into another bit of rainforest and light that up and keep the process going. So it was something none of us had ever expected to see, and now we know how it works. I personally don't know how to stop that apart from having a great many people on the ground and helicopter support, but we may not get that in the future, so I'm very concerned about that. Look, one of the other measures, and this is not a practical measure, it's a cultural measure, and that is that people need to know how precious these forests are. I think it's been, for a long time, people in this area have just accepted that we have rainforest, but when you pull your focus back a bit and realise what a tiny little green ribbon this rainforest is along our east coast, you realise that every single stick of it is incredibly important. And for that reason, I've become, you could call me extremist, but I've become more firm on the idea that we must not lose any more at all, and that goes for all habitat. For instance, koala habitat. We know that so many koalas have been lost in this recent burning season. That means that we cannot take down even another tree that a koala uses. We need a lot of them. And that goes for rainforests. We have to know that there's nothing more important than those trees in a global sense. And that means that people need to think about it in every way. So not just that we need to stop global heating, but they need to be aware of their own particular patch. And that brings this down to a very local level. And this happened at the Channon, by the way. The local people were fighting so strongly for their own forest that they got to know all the tracks, all the ways in, all the fire breaks, all the trees. And so it was a local response to defending their own particular patch of forest. Hopefully, I think this will happen in this whole area of rainforest, that the local people have suddenly realised, wow, this is incredibly important and I personally can do something about it. So I'm very hopeful in that way. But what I'm not hopeful about is bureaucratic and government responses that are across the board, such as we need more hazard reduction burning. which might mean all the sclerophyll forests around the rainforests get burnt. That would be the worst thing that could happen. So we need to tackle this on both a local level and a government level and a global level. And I also have to say, this spiritual level that I've learnt over the years of being in love with Terania Creek, that unless we have that spiritual connection to our land and the sense that we belong to it, not that it belongs to us, but we belong to it, then really we can't do anything.